Forget New Year, New You. This season is about slowing down, locking the doors, and cozying up at home with the one you really want to do nothing with. Your dog. After the holiday chaos, those quiet nights with a blanket, a podcast, and your pup feel like the reset you actually need. Ollie helps make those moments easier with fresh protein-packed meals made from real human-grade ingredients, so your dog can enjoy some quality comfort food too. Choose from 5 recipes and get a personalized plan for your dog's needs. Meals arrive perfectly proportioned with a scoop and storage container, so serving is fast and mess-free. And with Ollie's in-app on-demand health screenings, supporting your dog is easy, ensuring more cuddles for many years to come. Visit ollie.com/truecrime and use code TRUECRIME for 60% off your first box.
It was a crime that shocked an already marginalized community.
She was targeted for being a trans woman of color for her gender identity.
22-year-old Lateisha Green is shot to death, not far from where she lived. According to eyewitnesses, it was a targeted attack.
So Tish was shot and killed outside of a house party in Syracuse after reportedly hearing an anti-gay slur.
The main suspect goes to trial, not once, but twice. And the second time, he decides to represent himself.
I thought it was a bold move. Representing yourself pro se in New York is certainly allowed, but based on the evidence alone, I thought Mr. DeLee would have a really difficult time making the case for his innocence.
Would there be justice in this case, or would the murderer go free? Today's case is about 22-year-old Lateisha Green, a transgender woman who was murdered in November 2008. 19-year-old Dwight DeLee was charged in the case, but after 2 trials, one in which he represents himself, would we really find out what happened that night? This is Jillian, and you are listening to Court Junkie, episode 90. Before we get into today's episode, here's a quick word about one of our sponsors. Attention true crime lovers. The hit Reels channel show Autopsy is coming to Podcast One with all new episodes. Join Dr. Michael Hunter and those involved in the cases as they examine the autopsy reports for some of the most famous celebrity deaths of our time, including Patrick Swayze, Chris Farley, and Natalie Wood. Download new episodes of Autopsy every week on Apple Podcasts and Podcast One. Lateisha Green, affectionately known as Tish to her friends and family, grew up in Syracuse, New York. She was born under the name Moses Cannon, but at the age of 16 years old, she wrote a letter to her parents, Roxanne Green and Albert Cannon, telling them that she did not identify as a male, but that she was female. By all accounts, her family was very supportive. But on November 14th, 2008, Lateisha's family and friends' worst fears would come true. The night Lateisha was murdered was reportedly a normal Friday night for her. She and her 19-year-old brother, Mark Cannon, were driving around hanging out with friends. They arrived at 411 Seymour Street after Lateisha's friend, Alyssa Davis, had called her and told her to come over to a house party she was at. Mark, Lateisha, and another friend named Star arrived at the home about 8:40 p.m. Mark had driven them there in their father's car. Alyssa came out to greet them, and the 3 of them remained in the car while they talked to her. Mark was in the driver's seat, Lateisha was in the passenger seat, and Star in the back. 5 minutes after Mark had pulled up to the curb, a man in a dark hooded sweatshirt walked up to the car. He pointed the barrel of a .22 rifle and fired. Lateisha yelled at Mark to take off, and Mark, though stunned, drove off quickly. Lateisha kept saying, "My heart, my heart," but Mark told her she had only been hit in the shoulder. She would be fine. Mark headed towards the hospital, but Lateisha kept telling him to just drive home. Meanwhile, Star called 911 from the back seat. When they arrived at the home, Lateisha got out of the car and laid on the ground. She was in and out of consciousness. Her parents ran out on the lawn and made it to Lateisha's side just before she died from her injury. It wasn't until the ambulance arrived that Mark realized that he had been injured as well. The bullet that had entered Lateisha's shoulder had first grazed his arm. He was treated at the hospital and released. Officer Donor with the Syracuse Police Department was one of the first officers to arrive at 411 Seymour Street, where the shooting had occurred. He knocked on the front door when he arrived, and Alyssa Davis, Lateisha's friend, answered. Alyssa initially denied witnessing anything, and she said she hadn't heard any gunfire. Officer Donor took her to the police station for further questioning. On the way there, he mentioned that Lateisha had been shot. Up to this point, Alyssa didn't know that anyone in the car had been hit by the bullet. She became upset, and Officer Donor then asked if she knew Lateisha. He told her that Lateisha might be dying. Alyssa then broke down. She cried, saying that Lateisha was her best friend. When asked why Lateisha would have been shot, Alyssa reportedly told him it was because people thought she was gay. The investigation into Lateisha's murder was more about witness statements than forensics. However, a search of the Seymour Street house did secure a possible murder weapon. In a bedroom on the second floor, a rifle was found between the mattress and box spring of a bed. There had been approximately 14 people at the house at various points during the evening of the shooting, including multiple children. Within the first 24 hours, one name kept coming up again and again: 19-year-old Dwight DeLee. Dwight had left the house party immediately after the shooting. His girlfriend, Jasmine, and her brother, Johnny, gave him a ride to his cousin's house about 15 minutes away. Johnny gave police the address, and Dwight was arrested in the early morning hours of Sunday, November 16th. The detectives had Dwight read his rights out loud from a sheet of paper, and then had him initial the individual rights and sign at the bottom that he understood them. Dwight told the officers that he was at 411 Seymour Street on the day of the murder, but he had left around 4 p.m., long before the shooting happened. He said he went to his cousin's house to sleep because he was working that night. He was there until a little before 11 p.m. when he went to work. His timesheet corroborated that he was at work from 11 p.m. until 4 a.m. Dwight admitted that he was aware that police had been looking for him and that he hadn't come forward voluntarily. During the interview, he repeatedly said that it was over and that he couldn't beat the case. But he continued to assert his innocence and deny that he hated gay people. The interview was held over the course of nearly 6 hours, from 3 a.m. until 8:45 a.m. However, the questioning was intermittent and lasted for a combined 2 hours. Dwight DeLee was then charged with murder in the second degree, murder in the second degree as a hate crime, and criminal possession of a firearm in the third degree. He pleaded not guilty to all 3 charges and was held without bail. 8 months later, his trial would begin as New York's first hate crime prosecution involving the death of a transgender person. On July 11th, 2009, 2 days before the trial was set to begin, Lateisha's family held a memorial service for her. The service was held at the First English Lutheran Church, a church in Syracuse known at the time for being a welcoming place for members of the LGBTQ community. The service was not only to celebrate the life of Lateisha, but to also ask the public to stand against the type of hate that had led to her death. Andy Mara from the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund, or TILDEF, helped organize the memorial. She describes the first time she met Tisha's mom, Roxanne, with the preceding executive director from TILDEF.
The first time I met Roxanne, both Michael and I went to meet Tisha's mom and the rest of her family at their home in Syracuse. And when we were led into their house, I first met Roxanne sitting in a very dark living room, just sitting motionless. And we were there to brief the family on the case and prep them for the press conference as well as the trial, and what to expect. And Roxanne was just broken. And there was a point when we weren't sure if we were able to get through all of the prep. And so I made a very split decision that Roxanne and I were going to go to the nail salon and get a pedicure together. And from there, when we got her out of the house, and she was in the chair getting her nails done, that's when she started to open up and talk, and become a little bit more engaged. And at least for me personally, that's where I built my relationship with the family, and to make sure that Tisha's story as well as theirs were told fairly to the media, and to make sure that the facts about the case were also shared in a very non-sensationalized way with journalists and reporters covering the trial.
Through Roxanne, Andy felt like she really got to know Tish and her family.
It almost felt like Tish was with us all the time because of the immense love that Roxanne had for her daughter. Now, at that time in 2009, there wasn't the kind of visibility for transgender people that there is now in 2019. And to see that kind of overwhelming understanding and acceptance from a parent was magical.
Andy also attended the trial, along with an intern from TILDEF named Laura Vogel. Laura also posted daily blog posts about the court proceedings, which were incredibly helpful in making this episode. A quick word about the trial. Though Lateisha was transgender and identified herself as such, prosecutors believed that she was killed because Dwight DeLee believed that she was a gay man, not because she was transgender. This was how, technically, they were able to prosecute it as a hate crime. At the time of the trial, the murder of a transgender person was not considered a hate crime, but killing someone because of their sexual orientation was.
This is an important case in New York State history, in that Tish, as a trans woman of color, her case was brought forward under the New York State Hate Crimes Act, and the case was brought forward under the category of sexual orientation. So Tish, despite the fact that she was targeted for being a trans woman of color for her gender identity, Dwight DeLee, the assailant, targeted her based off of anti-gay sentiment or anti-gay motivations. So the Onondaga County District Attorney proceeded with the case as well as TILDEF to make sure that despite the fact that gender identity was not explicitly covered under law at that time in 2009, that the New York State Hate Crimes Act still applied.
The trial began with jury selection on July 13th, 2009, and the courtroom was packed. Almost every local media outlet and many national media outlets were there, covering the case. This was a time where anti-trans violence was on the rise, and the news wanted to cover it.
At that time, there was a string of high-profile deaths of trans people for very similar reasons. Shortly before Tisha's case, there was another case involving a trans Latina woman named Angie Zapata out in Colorado who was killed because of her gender identity. And so media at that time had developed a strong interest in covering these kinds of cases. The courtroom was packed. We got up very early just to make sure that we could have seats in the courtroom. And the atmosphere was palpably emotional. Tisha's family received an outpouring of support from not only her other family members and friends and neighbors, but from the broader community in Syracuse as well as across the state.
On the first day, it took until about 3 p.m. to seat a jury of 12 plus 2 alternates. After the presiding judge, William Walsh, gave the jury their instructions, opening statements began. Assistant District Attorney Matt Duran told the jury that this wasn't a whodunit, and that once they get through the unlikely stories, they will get to the simplest explanation, that Dwight DeLee pulled the trigger, and that he did so because he believed the occupants of the car, Lateisha and her brother Mark, were gay. Defense attorney Clarence Johnson asked the jury to have an open mind and to question the witnesses' recall from a night of drinking. The party was chaotic and the front yard was dark. He also pointed out that even if Dwight did pull the trigger, he would have had to have known Lateisha and Mark's sexual orientations at the time in order to form the intent necessary for a hate crime, and there was no evidence that he knew them or that they were gay. The first witness for the prosecution was Mark Cannon. Mark tearfully told the court the sequence of events that night. He said that he was looking back and forth between Lateisha, who was seated next to him, and the people standing outside the car talking to them. When he heard the gunshot, he turned towards the sound. He saw the barrel of a gun and Dwight DeLee standing there in a hooded sweatshirt. He initially thought Lateisha had only been shot in the arm, and her injury didn't appear to be serious, so he followed her instructions to drive home instead of to the hospital. Prosecutor Duran asked Mark to identify the shooter in court, and he pointed at the defense table. On cross-examination, Clarence Johnson questioned Mark about the clothing Lateisha was wearing. What Lateisha was wearing was a point the defense would bring up multiple times during the trial. One of their contentions was that Dwight had no way of knowing if Lateisha was gay. The night she was killed, Lateisha was wearing jeans, a t-shirt, and a leather jacket. The argument was that her clothes were not overtly feminine, and Dwight wouldn't have assumed she was dressed as a woman by looking at her. But Mark pointed out that Lateisha was also wearing a headscarf, the type traditionally worn by women. The jeans and t-shirt Lateisha was wearing were fitted, and the t-shirt was a scoop neck, a style less common in men's clothing. The defense then asked Mark if he could clearly see Dwight in the dark, and if he had actually seen the gun. Mark said yes, that he saw both clearly. The judge adjourned for the day after this, and when court resumed the next morning, Mark returned to the stand to complete the cross-examination. Mark was confronted with an inconsistency in his testimony. He had testified that he saw Dwight aim the gun at Lateisha, but in his initial statement to police, Mark had said that the gun was put into the car to shoot someone, not that it was aimed at Lateisha specifically. The defense then asked if Mark knew Dwight, and Mark replied that he did not. On redirect, Prosecutor Duran had Mark clarify that he meant he didn't know Dwight personally, but that he knew of him and had seen him around the neighborhood before. The prosecution then called Cassandra Williams to the stand. She lived near the scene of the crime and was present at the house on the night of the murder. She testified that she was standing in front of the house near a van owned by Dwight's girlfriend's brother, Johnny, when Mark, Lateisha, and Starr pulled up. She walked over to the car, but when she realized that they were people she didn't know, she went back to the van. As Cassandra walked back to the van, she heard a man named David Doughboy Junius use a homophobic slur. She believed a second man, Nico Lemon, may have said something similar. She then saw a man in a hooded sweatshirt go into the house and then come back to the yard with a rifle at his side. The man walked directly to the car and fired into it. The car took off, and Cassandra heard Alyssa scream, "Why did you do that? So what if they're gay?" On cross-examination, Cassandra was confronted with her police statement where she said that after the shooting, Nico was holding the gun and gave it to Doughboy, who then took the gun back into the house. But Cassandra insisted that the man she saw shoot the gun into the car was someone she didn't know, and she knew both Nico and Doughboy. Several police officers and crime scene investigators then testified to the evidence that was collected. The rifle that was recovered from the house didn't have any fingerprints on it. Ballistics tests showed that the marks on the bullet that had killed Lateisha were consistent with the gun found. However, the rifle was from the 1930s, and the barrel was worn. The marks left weren't distinct enough to match the bullet to the gun with 100% accuracy. Next, Dr. Robert Stopaker, the chief medical examiner, then testified about the cause of death. Though the gunshot wound to Lateisha's left arm appeared minor from the outside, the bullet had traveled through her arm and into her chest. It went through her left lung, through her aorta, and then into her right lung. Lateisha bled into her chest cavity, losing about 1/5 of her total blood supply. The prosecution then began a parade of partygoers to testify about what they saw and heard that night. They started with Johnny Gaston. If you remember, Dwight was dating Johnny's sister Jasmine, and Johnny was the one who drove Dwight away from the crime scene after the shooting. Johnny was a reluctant witness and had to be told to speak up multiple times. His timeline of events directly contradicted what Dwight had told police. Instead of arriving and leaving by 4 p.m., Johnny said they didn't arrive until 7. After they were at the party for a while, Johnny heard a pop, and when he looked up, he saw Mark's car driving away. He testified he saw Alyssa and another friend, Erica, standing near the street at the time. Prosecutor Duran then had Johnny read a portion of his initial statement to police to refresh his memory, because in that statement, he said he saw Dwight standing near the sidewalk as well. Johnny was asked if Dwight said anything on the ride from the Seymour Street house to his cousin's house. Johnny testified that Dwight hadn't said anything, but again, his police statement was read. Johnny had told the police that Dwight said he aimed the gun into the car, but it went off when someone inside the car pulled on the barrel. On cross-examination, Johnny told the court that he just said yes to whatever the police told him during his interview. He said he was afraid that he would be arrested if he didn't. After the officers typed up the statement, he signed it so he could go home, and he said his statement was not accurate. Johnny's sister, Jasmine, testified next. Jasmine testified that she heard Nico use a slur and saw someone with a gun walk up to the car. But this was contradicted by her police statement, where she had said she saw Dwight fire the gun into the car. Jasmine then testified that they went to Dwight's cousin's house, and Dwight left for work. While he was at work, she didn't speak to him. But again, referring to her police statement, Jasmine had told police that Dwight called her on his breaks to say he felt bad about what happened, and he hoped no one was hurt. Like her brother, Jasmine testified on cross-examination that she had only signed the statement because she was scared and wanted to go home. She said she wasn't a strong reader and didn't read the statement prior to signing it. Judge Walsh adjourned the court at 5 p.m. About 15 minutes later, news crews waiting outside of the courthouse caught a physical altercation on camera. The footage was later shown to the judge. It reportedly showed friends and family of Dwight making threats toward Lateisha's friends and family, and a fight then broke out. The next morning, with the jury out of the courtroom, Judge Walsh said that what he saw disgraced the life and legacy of Lateisha, and he warned against any further incidents. The jury was then brought back into the courtroom, and the testimony of the partygoers continued. Erica Allison testified she heard Dwight use a gay slur, but didn't see him with the gun. Her testimony mainly just established who was at the party. On cross-examination, she said that Lateisha was wearing women's clothes, but was dressed less overtly feminine than usual. David Doughboy Junius also testified as to who was at the house that night. He then said that when Mark, Lateisha, and Star arrived, he was standing with Nico Lemon and Dwight. Doughboy admitted he used a gay slur, saying he didn't want them at his house. He said he had a gun in his nephew's closet. Dwight then said that he would shoot them. He watched as Dwight went into the house, came out of the house, and walked over to the car. The car then sped away. Doughboy said he didn't hear the gunshot because the music was too loud, and he didn't see Dwight holding the gun until after Mark had driven away. He then saw Dwight give the gun to Nico, who then put it in the basement. Doughboy said he later went down to the basement and brought the gun up to his mother's bedroom. He hid it under the mattress, where police would later find it. Nico Lemon was the next to testify. He said he saw Dwight walk up to the car, but he didn't see the gun, even though he had signed a police statement claiming that he did see the gun. He told the court that he was so drunk that night that he just wanted to go home, and so he signed the statement when it was put in front of him. He also denied he or anyone else used any derogatory slurs about Lateisha, Mark, or Star. Nico did back up Doughboy's account, however, of who handled the gun after the shooting. During cross-examination, Nico said he saw individuals he didn't know in hooded sweatshirts near the house. After Nico finished testifying, a lunch break was called. Before the jury was brought back in, Judge Walsh addressed Dwight directly. Judge Walsh had been told that people connected with Dwight had been threatening witnesses. He warned that charges would be brought if it continued. The jury was then brought back in, and the trial proceeded. A witness who had been standing near the car, Carlisha Junius, testified that she saw Dwight walk towards the car and say that the people inside needed to leave. She then saw him fire into the car, though to her, it didn't look like he took aim at anyone in particular. Alyssa Davis, Lateisha's friend who had called her to the house that night, took the stand next. She said that while she was standing at the car talking to Mark and Lateisha, she heard a man's voice behind her say, "Alyssa, get them out of here," and then use a gay slur. She said a dark-skinned man in a hooded sweatshirt walked up and put a gun in the window. He told them to get out of there, and then he fired one shot. Though Alyssa said she only saw the hands of the man, she assumed they belonged to Dwight DeLee. She testified that she had recognized his voice when he told them to leave, and he was the only dark-skinned black man at the party. The prosecution then called their last witness, Star Hopper. From the back seat of the car, she didn't see anything before she heard a bang and saw a flash. Then she looked over in time to see a dark-skinned man she didn't know in a blue hooded sweatshirt. After her testimony, the prosecution then rested. I asked Andy about Dwight's demeanor while the prosecution was presenting their evidence, and while all those eyewitnesses were identifying him as the shooter. She told me he didn't really react to anything. He was pretty much stone-faced throughout.
Dwight lacked emotion, and he also lacked remorse. There were times when I think he could have easily reacted to a number of accounts or questions, but he was emotionless. And I think that was what really stuck with me, as well as Tisha's family, as we sat in the courtroom.
The defense called only one witness, Sheila Gentile. Gentile was a DNA expert who analyzed the gun found at the scene and later identified by Doughboy as the murder weapon. 3 DNA samples were lifted from the gun. None of them matched Dwight D. Lee. But Gentile also testified that not everyone who touched the gun would have necessarily left DNA behind, and that placing the gun under a mattress could have led to some DNA being removed from the gun. When Gentile left the stand, the defense rested their case. They then asked the judge to allow the jury to consider the lesser offenses of manslaughter in the first and second degrees, as well as manslaughter in the first and second degrees as a hate crime. Judge Walsh agreed to include the lesser charges in the jury instructions. Court was adjourned with closing arguments to be made the next morning. Have you ever thought about just how little you know about your parents? Did you ever ask your mom about the time she starred in the school play? Do you know any stories from your dad's time in the military? I know my mom has some really funny stories about growing up with her brother, my uncle, and my dad is always talking about his various experiences working in law enforcement. Well, now, Forevernote makes it easy for families to preserve their most precious memories, traditions, and stories. Here's how it works. The process is really simple. Sign up a loved one and schedule a convenient phone interview, which can be done in English, Spanish, Mandarin, Korean, or Tagalog. The Forevernote team then transcribes the audio from the interview and prints it as a beautiful keepsake quality book. It's as easy as that. The book is professionally edited and designed and lets you discover details about your loved ones' lives that you never knew. Similar services may cost upwards of $2,000, but with Forevernote, you get a book authentic to your loved one's voice, starting at just $99. Visit forevernote.com and enter promo code COURT for a special offer, $25 off, and to get started today. Give the gift of a lifetime in time for the holidays. That's forevernote.com, promo code COURT. Clarence Johnson, Dwight's defense attorney, approached his closing arguments in 3 parts. First, he attempted to provide reasonable doubt that Dwight was the shooter by setting up the crime scene. It was dark outside, and there were a number of people, both at the party and in the neighborhood. Many of the witnesses were drunk at the time, making their memories unreliable. The witness who had the best vantage point to identify Dwight was Mark Cannon, and he was also experiencing trauma at the time. Johnson also pointed out that the witnesses contradicted each other over what they saw and heard. Further, he said the only forensic evidence was DNA found on the gun, and that did not match Dwight. The second part of his closing arguments addressed the issue of intent, which would be necessary for a second-degree murder conviction. Even Mark and Starr testified that they did not know if the shooter had pointed the gun at anyone or if he had just fired into the car randomly. The third part of his closing arguments challenged the hate crime charge. The shooter would have had to think before the shooting that Lateisha was gay. If Dwight was the shooter, it wouldn't have been a hate crime since he did not know Lateisha prior to this, and Lateisha was not obviously dressed in feminine clothing, he said. In short, Johnson made a case for reasonable doubt that Dwight was the shooter, that the shooter had intent to kill, and that the shooter knew the sexual orientation of the victim. Now it was the prosecution's turn. Prosecutor Matt Duran went back to his opening statement, repeating that the simplest explanation was the correct one. Even though witnesses varied in their exact retellings of the night of the murder, there were a few consistent threads, he said. People were heard using homophobic slurs in reference to the occupants of the car. Even if Dwight didn't know they were gay before that night, he would have known it from the reactions of those around him. And then multiple witnesses put the gun in Dwight's hands before and during the shooting. None of the witnesses saw anyone else with the gun until after the shooting, when Nico and Doughboy attempted to hide it. Duran asked the jury to see the simplest explanation to the events of that night and find Dwight DeLee guilty of second-degree murder as a hate crime. Judge Walsh gave the jury their instructions and explained the different charges. He said that the hate crime charge meant that they believed the victim was targeted because of her sexual orientation. Murder in the second degree meant that the shooter intended to kill the victim. Manslaughter in the first degree meant that the shooter intended to cause serious injury and that injury led to death. And manslaughter in the second degree meant that the shooter was acting recklessly, and that reckless action then led to the victim's death. If the jury did not believe that Lateisha was targeted due to her sexual orientation, but did believe that Dwight pulled the trigger, they could find him guilty of those same charges without the hate crime charge. After additional instructions, the jury was sent back to deliberate. The jury, based on the number of notes they sent to the judge, seemed to be very thorough in their deliberations. They asked to have all of the evidence brought back to their room, as well as to have key testimony read back to them. They also asked for the judge to again explain the differences between the charges. Later, on the first day of their deliberations, they asked to hear the definitions of just manslaughter in the first and second degrees as hate crimes again. After a long day, the jurors went home without reaching a verdict. At 8:30 in the morning on Friday, July 17th, the jury returned and asked the judge if they could have Mark Cannon's testimony read back to them. 30 minutes later, they announced they had reached their verdict. The jury found Dwight guilty of manslaughter in the first degree as a hate crime and guilty of criminal possession of a weapon in the third degree. They acquitted him on the remaining charges, including the charge of regular manslaughter in the first degree. Clarence Johnson immediately moved to vacate the conviction. With an acquittal of manslaughter in the first degree, the jury couldn't possibly have found Dwight guilty of manslaughter in the first degree as a hate crime, he said. The two verdicts were contradictory. Judge Walsh said he understood the defense's position, but he discharged the jury, allowing the verdict to stand. After the verdict was read, Lateisha's family held a press conference. They said they were glad that the hate crime was included in the jury's decision.
It was the first time a New York jury had delivered a hate crime conviction in the killing of a transgender person, which made that particular case historic. And it was also only the second hate crime conviction in the nation stemming from the killing of a transgender person.
Andy told me that she, too, has experienced violence due to the fact that she, like Lateisha, is also a transgender woman of color. So sitting through this trial was difficult for her.
It is one thing to experience it personally, but it is another to observe and be a part of supporting a family who has experienced that kind of violence as well. And the lack of remorse, the lack of emotion just spoke to the fact that there are so many cases like Lateisha's where transgender women of color in particular are targeted because of their gender identity. And there are numerous accounts of transgender women of color across the country experiencing violence in some of the most gruesome ways at the hands of cisgender men or non-transgender men. And to directly and personally see a man who committed this very gruesome act of violence against another person and to see that they lack any kind of remorse just shook me. To know that for some people who do commit these acts, that they do see transgender people as being less than, that we are not worthy of respect or being treated with dignity, and that our lives mean so little that it wouldn't even warrant an emotional reaction after the act was committed.
Lateisha's mother, Roxanne, told Essence magazine that she hoped some good came out of their family's ordeal. In addition to losing Lateisha and going through the stress of a trial, the family had been threatened, both in person and through text messaging. They hoped that would stop as the trial was behind them. Dwight's sentencing hearing was held on August 18, 2009. Defense counsel Clarence Johnson reminded Judge Walsh of his motion to vacate the inconsistent jury verdict. The prosecution argued against this, saying that the verdict was valid. Judge Walsh ruled in favor of the state, and so the sentencing hearing moved to the reading of the family's victim impact statement. Roxanne Green, with Lateisha's father Albert by her side, chose to address Dwight directly. She told him that the family suffers every day from the loss of Lateisha. She hoped others would learn from the tragedy and that no other family would experience the pain her family has. The prosecution argued for the maximum sentence allowed by law due to the senseless nature of the crime. Dwight then chose to speak to the court. He offered condolences to Lateisha's family for their loss, and then apologized to his own family about the stress this had put on them. But he maintained his innocence, saying he was not a monster and he wasn't homophobic. Judge Walsh then sentenced Dwight to the maximum sentence allowed by law, 3.5 to 7 years for the criminal possession of a weapon charge, and 25 years for the crime of manslaughter in the first degree as a hate crime. These sentences were to run concurrently. Dwight began the appeals process shortly after his sentencing, based on jury verdict issues raised at the end of his trial and again at his sentencing. His attorney contended that he could not be found guilty of first-degree manslaughter as a hate crime without also being guilty of ordinary first-degree manslaughter. In July 2013, a New York State appellate court agreed in a 4-1 ruling. They declared the original verdict inconsistent and said that the jurors may have been confused by the judge's instructions. The court set aside the verdict, and Dwight DeLee was released from prison.
Having been in the courtroom and witnessing the number of accounts that were shared with the members of the jury, the evidence that was presented, and the district attorney's office laying everything out very clearly. So I was very surprised by the decision to overturn, and quite frankly, I was hurt, and I myself didn't. I don't think I was hurt, but I think I was hurt by the fact that Tisha's family had to relive this very dark moment in their lives all over again. You know, Tisha's mom, Roxanne, when the verdict was overturned, she said to a journalist, you know, I am outraged that our daughter's killer was released from prison on a technicality. Where is the justice? I cannot believe you can kill someone, get convicted, sentenced, and then all of a sudden you are free. And my heart just went out for Roxanne and the rest of her family who had to re-grieve and relive all of the events that led to Tish being killed.
The district attorney's office appealed the decision to the New York State Court of Appeals. Multiple LGBTQ advocacy organizations filed amicus briefs, which are legal documents filed in appellate court by someone who is not a party to the case. They're filed to provide the court with additional information, and oftentimes advocacy groups will file these to inform the court of the broader implications of the case.
So the jury found that Mr. DeLee was not guilty of first-degree manslaughter, but was guilty of first-degree manslaughter as a hate crime. And so the Fourth Appellate Division tossed out the original conviction, concluding that there was jury confusion about the judge's instructions that led to a conflicting verdict. Now, at the time, when in 2013, when the original conviction was tossed out, Tilda strongly disagreed with the Fourth Appellate Division's conclusion, and we argued at the time that the jury reached a proper verdict based on its understanding of the judge's instructions, viewing first-degree manslaughter alone as a lesser offense and therefore choosing not guilty on that charge, but concluding that first-degree manslaughter as a hate crime was indeed the correct verdict and therefore convicting Mr. Dealey on that charge.
A hearing was held in October of 2014, after which the court unanimously agreed with the lower court's decision. Because Dwight was found not guilty of second-degree murder and first- and second-degree manslaughter at his 2009 trial, he could not be retried on those charges due to double jeopardy laws. However, the court left open the option for the DA to retry Dwight on the first-degree manslaughter as a hate crime charge. Roxanne told the media that she would continue to fight for justice for her beloved daughter, and she was glad the court would allow for a retrial. The district attorney's office ordered a reinvestigation of the case, and they presented the evidence to a grand jury in 2016. After more than 2 years of freedom, Dwight Dealey, now 27 years old, was rearrested on June 7, 2016, and held without bail. He was now facing the sole charge of manslaughter in the first degree as a hate crime. Sadly, Lateisha's mother, Roxanne, never got to see that indictment come down. Shortly beforehand, she passed away after battling an illness. It would take close to 3 years for this case to go to trial, but in the summer of 2018, a trial date was set for March 11, 2019. A few weeks before his trial was scheduled to start, Dwight moved to represent himself at his retrial. He claimed that his court-appointed attorney, Charles Keller, wasn't doing enough to defend him. A week before the trial, a hearing was held, and presiding judge Stephen Doherty ruled that he could represent himself, with Charles Keller as standby counsel. This trial would be an uphill battle, and not just for the defendant representing himself. The prosecution also had many hurdles to overcome. Any trial 10 years after the crime is difficult. Witnesses' memories fade and change over time. But in addition to that, the only charge the jury could consider was first-degree manslaughter as a hate crime. The prosecutor had to prove first that Dwight was the shooter. Then he had to prove that there was intent to cause serious injury and that Lateisha was targeted because Dwight believed she was gay. If the jury found reasonable doubt existed on any of those points, Dwight would walk free. One of the state's key witnesses, a man who has not been named in the media, attempted suicide the weekend before the retrial was set to begin. He was involuntarily committed to a psychiatric hospital. Prosecutor Joseph Coulacan additionally told the court that witnesses reported to him that they had been receiving threats leading up to the retrial, an accusation that had also been made during the first trial. Dwight protested the trial going forward at all, saying he didn't have enough time to prepare. However, Judge Doherty reminded him that the trial date had been set for 8 months, and he was warned when he chose to represent himself that the trial would go ahead as scheduled. With that, jury selection took much of the rest of the first day. On the second day of the retrial, Mark Cannon was called to the stand. Since he was acting as his own attorney, Dwight was now in a position to cross-examine him. Early in the cross-examination, Dwight asked Mark if he harbored ill will towards him. Mark replied that he had forgiven Dwight. That set the tone of the cross-examination as more cordial than you might expect. Mark testified that he heard Dwight use a homophobic slur, which is a statement Mark did not make in the previous police interviews or at the first trial. This part of the story was first introduced in Mark's 2016 grand jury testimony. Dwight pressed him on this, but Mark continued to insist that he heard the derogatory statements. When asked why he didn't mention it prior to 2016, Mark said that he was messed up and confused after witnessing Lateisha's murder, and that his memory was clearer after some time had passed. Mark wasn't the only witness with changing testimony. For many, this was their fourth time testifying. They testified at the first grand jury, the first trial, and the second grand jury. Dwight was able to use any inconsistencies to challenge the witnesses' recollections. On Wednesday, March 13th, the third day of trial, a reluctant witness was called to the stand. She has not been identified in the media, but she was someone who testified in the first trial. She had to be forced to take the stand, and she covered her face with her sweatshirt. With the jury not present, she told the judge that she would not testify, and she tried to run out of the courtroom. Court officers arrested her, and she chose to take a 30-day jail sentence rather than testify. Her testimony from the first trial was then read to the jury. The witness who had attempted suicide was released from the hospital a few days into the trial. He was immediately arrested as a material witness, but the prosecution and the defense agreed that he was in no state to testify, so the jury never heard from him. Both the witness who had harmed himself and the witness who refused to testify were people who had claimed that they heard Dwight use a slur against Lateisha, Mark, and Star. This testimony was important to prove the hate crime aspect of the shooting. The trial finished on Friday, March 15th, with closing arguments. Dwight told the jury that he was innocent. He then presented diagrams and boards to help illustrate his points. One graphic listed all of the witnesses and their relationships with one another. He pointed out the changing stories, claiming many of the witnesses were protecting their loved ones. The darkness, the drinking, and the loud music could have confused people on what exactly happened. Prosecutor Joseph Coolican's summation pointed out what was argued in the first trial, that every witness accounts point in some way to Dwight as the shooter. He then brought up a moment in the trial that Coolican said sounded like Dwight had given himself away. An expert witness for the prosecution said that multiple rounds had been loaded into the gun at the time. On cross, Dwight challenged this by explaining how only one round could have been loaded. The gun did not belong to Dwight, so how would he have known this unless he was the one loading the gun that night? The jury deliberated for a few hours, and much of that time was spent having testimony read back to them. By 5:30 on Friday afternoon, just hours after closing arguments, they had a verdict. Dwight was found not guilty of manslaughter in the first degree as a hate crime. Dwight was not released from custody immediately, as he had another case pending for a completely unrelated issue. When he was released on Saturday, March 16, 2019, he reportedly embraced his two young children, one of whom was a newborn in 2016 when he had been rearrested.
There is no winner at the end of the day. Not for Tish and her surviving family members, nor Mr. DeLee, who spent almost a decade of his life in prison. And I say that there's no winner on either side because of the fact that not only did we lose a life of another transgender woman of color, where it is now a widely understood statistic, but the fact that Mr. DeLee walked away from this trial, and I'm unclear if he understands the larger factors that contributed to his sentiment. I think we as a society have failed not just Tish, but also Mr. DeLee as well, in that we need to do a better job at not just lifting up the visibility of transgender people in our communities, but we also need to tell our stories and share our lives where people understand that we are people who live in your communities, who want to work alongside you, who attend church with you, who want to be thriving members of any community. And we have value and we have worth, and we as a society have failed in not only sharing that narrative, but also promoting it. And it's incumbent upon us moving forward, especially in the climate that we exist in today, to remind people of our inherent worth.
No one on the jury has spoken as to which element of the charge they found reasonable doubt on. Did they believe Dwight was the shooter, but didn't believe he had the intent to hurt anyone? Or did they not think Lateisha was targeted due to her sexual orientation? Or is it possible they did not feel confident that Dwight was the shooter at all?
Because of her death, because of the fact that she was killed as a result of her gender identity, she was denied the ability to pursue her dreams and her goals for her life. And I think that narrative is sadly and infuriatingly the most common narrative for transgender women, particularly transgender women of color. There is a palpable fear in the community that transgender women won't live beyond the age of 35 because so many of us have been targeted and killed as a result of our gender identity. And often in some of the most vile and gruesome ways, there has been accounts of transgender women of color being shot down, being hung, being burned alive, and there often is no justice.
In January 2019, the Gender Expression Non-Discrimination Act, or GENDA, was enacted in the state of New York. This makes it now against the law to discriminate against someone based on gender identity or expression. And it also adds gender identity and gender expression to the protected classes under the state's human rights and hate crime laws.
Despite the fact that Tisha's case goes as far back as 2008 when she was killed at that house party, I think most people listening to this podcast would think, oh, that case is from more than 10 years ago. But the reality is that this incident has been occurring across the country since 2008 and beyond 2008 and is on the rise. Anti-trans violence is something that is not only being documented as being on the rise, but transgender people across the country, particularly transgender people of color, are incredibly fearful of their safety. And there is an absolute need now, more than ever, for non-transgender people as allies to stand with transgender people in all of the organizing and advocacy that is occurring right now, ranging from making sure that transgender people are able to participate in their local communities, to making sure that good common sense laws are passed in local, state, and federal bodies that protect transgender people from discrimination and violence. And I think undergirding that, there is an absolute need for greater understanding and awareness of the law of our lives, and to build bridges and to not only share stories about our lives, but also to understand that ultimately, at the end of the day, we are people who are deserving of respect and dignity, just as anyone else is in this country.
Andy tells me that a transgender person, on average, is murdered once a month in the United States. In the last 2 years, there has been a spike of documented cases. And that's all for today's episode. As always, I'd love to know what you think. Do you think the first verdict in the first trial was confusing? Do you think Dwight DeLee is innocent, or do you think he got away with murder? Let me know by joining the conversation on Instagram @CourtJunkie, by tweeting me @CourtJunkiePod, or by emailing me at podcast@courtjunkie.com. I want to thank Andy Mara from Tildef for talking to me about Lateisha's case. For more information on their organization, please visit transgenderlegal.org. This episode was researched and written by Charlie Worroll and myself, Jillian Jalali. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.